They said she was bad luck, a ghost brought over the salt sea to sour the land. They said she was a poison come from a faraway place to ruin good men. They said the burlap sack over her head was a mercy, meant to hide a face so cursed it would curdle milk and spook horses. In the frozen mud of the town of Precipice, the truth was much simpler and far crueler. The man holding her arm, a thick-fingered brute named Barrett, who owned the town's only saloon and half its soul, was simply tired of his problem. The girl stood silently, a small figure in a pale pink silken dress, the fine fabric a shocking delicacy against the grime of the street and the coarse weave of the sack that covered her from the neck up. The dress was torn at the hem, stained with mud, but it still held a ghost of elegance that made the whole scene feel even more profane. A small crowd had gathered, their faces pinched by the cold, their eyes hungry for a spectacle. Jonas saw it all from the doorway of the general store. He was a mountain of a man, built of the same hard granite as the peaks he called home, with a long dark beard tangled by the wind, and hair that fell past his broad shoulders. He came down from his isolation only when the seasons demanded it, for salt and steel traps and coffee, and he hated the stink of towns, the way men huddled together like nervous sheep. He was about to turn and leave, to let the ugliness play out as it always did, when Barrett gave the girl a rough shake. The small body swayed, but made no sound. "She needs a husband," Barrett announced to the crowd, his voice a gravelly proclamation. "A legal bond. Someone to take this burden off my hands. Someone to give her a name and a roof. Any takers? She's a hard worker, I'm told, and quiet." A few men snickered. The offer was an insult disguised as charity. She was being discarded like a lame horse. Jonas's hand, which had been resting on the door frame, tightened into a fist, the knuckles white. He despised men like Barrett, men who used their strength to break smaller things. He watched as Barrett grew impatient, his grip on the girl's arm tightening until she must have been bruised beneath the silk. A small, almost imperceptible flinch was the only sign she gave. That was it. That was the moment the world shifted. Jonas pushed himself away from the doorframe, his heavy boots making deep prints in the frozen muck. He moved through the parted crowd, a silent force that drew every eye. He was larger than any man there, an entity of the wilderness that had strayed into their petty domain. He stopped a few feet from Barrett, his shadow falling over both the man and his captive. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. Barrett, unnerved by the giant's silent approach, puffed out his chest. "What do you want, mountain man? Come for the show?" Jonas's eyes, the color of a winter sky, didn't even flicker toward him. They were fixed on the slight figure in the pink dress, on the cruel sack that denied her a face. He had seen bears caught in traps with more dignity left to them. The injustice of it settled in his gut like a cold stone. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled out not a weapon, but 3 silver coins, worn smooth with time. He tossed them onto the muddy ground between Barrett's feet. They landed with a soft, final thud. "I'll take her," Jonas said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding deep in the earth. The words hung in the frigid air. Barrett stared at the coins, then back at Jonas, a slow, incredulous grin spreading across his face. "You want this thing?" Jonas didn't answer. He simply waited, his stillness more menacing than any threat. The grin on Barrett's face faded. He saw no joke in the mountain man's eyes. He saw something cold and absolute. He shoved the girl forward. "Fine, she's your problem now." A stooped man with a dusty ledger was summoned from the crowd, a preacher who did Barrett's bidding. Jonas scrawled his name on the line, the ink bleeding into the cheap paper. A marriage, they called it. It felt more like claiming freight. He turned and gently took the girl's arm. Her sleeve was thin and cold beneath his fingers. "Walk," he said, the single word a command, but his tone was not unkind. He led her away from the gaping crowd, away from the town, heading for the snow-dusted trail that led up into the silence of the high peaks. The climb was long and arduous. The trail narrowed, winding through dense pine and skeletal aspen, the snow growing deeper with every upward step. The girl, whose name he did not know, followed without a word. She stumbled often on the icy patches, her thin slippers offering no grip, but she never cried out, never complained. Each time she fell, Jonas would stop, waiting patiently as she righted herself, his large hand hovering near her back, ready to offer support, but never forcing it. He was acutely aware of the absurdity of the situation. He had left his cabin at dawn for flour and shot, and now he was returning with a wife, a woman whose face he had never seen. The town of Precipice vanished behind a curtain of falling snow, and with it the world of men. Up here there was only the wind whistling through the timber, the crunch of their boots in the snow, and the vast, unforgiving silence of the mountains. It was a silence Jonas had always cherished, but now it felt different, filled with the presence of the small, anonymous woman behind him. They reached his cabin as dusk began to bleed purple and gray across the sky. It was not a home so much as a fortress, built of thick, hand-hewn logs, with a low roof and small windows that looked like suspicious eyes. A plume of smoke still curled from the stone chimney, a remnant of the morning's fire. He pushed open the heavy plank door and stood aside, gesturing for her to enter. She hesitated for only a second before crossing the threshold. He followed her in, the scent of pine, wood smoke, and curing hides enveloping them. The space was small, dominated by a large stone hearth where embers still glowed, a rough sawn table, a single chair, and a bed built into the wall were the only furniture. He closed the door, the sound echoing in the stillness, and slid the heavy wooden bar into place. It was a sound of safety and a sound of imprisonment. He turned to face her. She stood in the center of the room, a fragile splash of pink against the dark wood, the burlap sack a grotesque mockery in the warm, dim light of the cabin. He did not approach her. He stoked the embers in the hearth, adding fresh logs until a steady fire crackled to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet competence that spoke of a life lived alone. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the flames. All the while she remained perfectly still, a silent statue in the middle of his world. He knew he should say something, do something, but the right words would not come. He was a man of actions, not speeches. Forcing her to remove the sack felt like another violation, another act of ownership he had no right to. So he waited. He sat in the lone chair by the fire, his great frame making it look like a child's toy, and watched her. The silence stretched, broken only by the hiss and pop of the burning logs. He was prepared to wait all night. Then he saw her hands lift. They were small, her fingers slender, and they moved with a slow, deliberate grace. They found the bottom edge of the burlap sack. For a moment they paused, and he felt a strange tightening in his chest. Then with a smooth, certain motion she pulled it up and over her head. Her dark hair, pinned in a simple knot, tumbled loose around her shoulders. She dropped the sack to the floor as if it were a dead thing. She turned her head to face him fully. One side of her face was swollen and bruised, a dark purple mark blooming beneath a sharp cheekbone. But her other cheek was flawless, her skin pale like porcelain in the firelight. Her eyes were dark, almond-shaped, and held a depth of intelligence and defiance that took his breath away. There was no fear in them, only assessment. She looked at him, at the rifle leaning against the wall, at the barred door, taking in every detail of her new prison. He had expected tears, or terror, or pleading. He was prepared for any of it. He was not prepared for her to speak. Her voice was clear, low, and carried no trace of the broken accent he had imagined. "They will come for you," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea for protection. It was a statement of cold, hard fact. Jonas froze, his hands resting on his knees. She was not warning him about a danger to herself. She was warning him about a danger to him. She saw him not as a savior, but as a man who had just painted a target on his own back. In that moment, the power dynamic he had assumed, the one where he was the strong rescuer and she the helpless victim, shattered completely. She was something else entirely. For 3 days, a tense and quiet routine settled over the cabin. She moved about the small space with a silent efficiency that amazed him. She found his meager supplies and created meals that were surprisingly flavorful. She mended the tear in her pink dress with a needle and thread she discovered in a small tin box, her stitches impossibly small and neat. She never spoke of what had happened in the town, and he never asked. They communicated in gestures and brief, necessary words. Coffee, wood, more water. He watched her constantly, not with suspicion, but with a growing sense of wonder. She was not broken. She was coiled, like a spring, full of a strength that was far less obvious but no less potent than his own. He learned her name on the second day. He had come in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots, and found her staring out the small window at the endless expanse of white. "Lynn," she said, without turning around. It was an offering. "Jonas," he replied, his own name feeling rough and clumsy in the quiet space. On the third night, it happened. A storm had blown in, the wind howling like a hungry animal around the eaves of the cabin. Jonas was cleaning his rifle by the fire when the sound of his dogs barking frantically from their lean-to broke the night's peace. It was not their usual bark for a wandering deer or a curious fox. This was a sound of alarm, sharp and vicious. He stood instantly, the rifle now heavy and ready in his hands. Lynn didn't scream or run to hide. She moved to the main lamp, turned the wick down until the flame vanished, plunging the room into the flickering, unreliable light of the hearth. Her movements were swift and sure. She understood that light made them a target. From the darkness a voice bellowed, carried on the wind. "Jonas, mountain man, we know you're in there. Send out Barrett's property." It was one of Barrett's cronies. Jonas moved to the window, peering through a small crack in the shutter. He could make out 3 figures on horseback, dark shapes against the swirling snow. They were armed. He felt Lynn's presence beside him. She held out his powder horn and a small leather pouch of shot. Her face was a pale oval in the gloom, her expression grim but steady. They hadn't spoken a word, yet they were moving as a team. A rock shattered the window pane, spraying glass and icy wind into the cabin. A muzzle flashed in the darkness outside, and a bullet thudded into the log wall above the hearth. Jonas didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, took aim at the flash, and fired. The roar of the gun filled the small cabin, a deafening declaration. A scream tore through the night, followed by curses. The men outside had not expected such a swift, violent response. They fired a few more wild shots before the sound of retreating hooves faded into the storm. Jonas stood at the shattered window, listening until there was only the wind again. He lowered the rifle. He could feel Lynn breathing beside him. The first test had come, and they had met it. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the winter air, that this was only the beginning. The immediate threat was gone, but the cold it left behind had little to do with the broken window. Jonas jammed a spare bearskin into the shattered frame, a temporary shield against the biting wind. The silence that fell between them was different now, heavier with shared violence and unspoken questions. He reloaded the rifle, his large hands moving with practiced familiarity. Lynn swept up the shards of broken glass with a small broom she had fashioned from pine boughs. They worked without speaking, 2 people cleaning up the mess of a world that refused to leave them alone. Finally, they sat by the fire, the warmth a small comfort against the vast, hostile wilderness outside and the new danger that had found them within it. He looked at her, at the determined set of her jaw in the firelight, and knew he had to ask. "Why does he want you?" he asked, his voice low. "Why call you property?" Lynn stared into the flames for a long time, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing light. When she spoke, her voice was even, stripped of emotion, as if she were reciting a history that belonged to someone else. "My father sent me to this country to be a companion to an American surveyor's wife. He was mapping a new railroad line through these mountains. His wife died of fever. The surveyor, Mr. Gable, was a kind man. He taught me to speak English well. He was going to send me home." She paused, taking a slow breath. Barrett was a partner in the railroad survey. He was cheating the company, buying land cheap along the proposed route and selling it back at a huge profit. Mr. Gable discovered it. He had ledgers, proof. He confronted Barrett. Her eyes finally lifted from the fire to meet his. "Barrett killed him. I was the only one who saw. He could not kill me without drawing the attention of the railroad company, so he decided to erase me instead. He took my name, my voice. He put the sack on my head and told the town I was a cursed half-wit he had taken in out of pity. No one would listen to a woman without a face." The story settled between them, stark and ugly. She wasn't a curse. She was a witness. The sack hadn't been to hide her face. It had been to hide his crime. A slow, hot anger began to burn in Jonas's chest, an anger far hotter than the fire in the hearth. He had not saved a victim. He had taken on a warrior who had been temporarily disarmed. He looked at her hands, now resting in her lap. They were not the soft, useless hands of a pampered companion. They were capable, strong. A strange tenderness bloomed in him, a fierce, protective urge that was entirely new. It wasn't pity. It was respect. Deep, profound respect. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching the bruise on her cheek. It was the first time he had touched her skin. She didn't flinch. She simply held his gaze, her dark eyes searching his. In that moment, something shifted between them. A silent acknowledgement of a bond forged not by a forced signature in a ledger, but by fire and glass and a shared truth in the heart of a storm. They both knew Barrett would be back. He wasn't a man to accept defeat, especially not a public one at the hands of a mountain hermit and the woman he had tried to discard. Waiting for the next attack was not an option. It was a death sentence. For the next few days they prepared. Jonas knew every rock, ravine, and game trail on this mountain. It was his home, and he would make it his fortress. But it was Lynn who saw the land with a different set of eyes. "He will not use the main trail again," she said one morning, pointing from the cabin door. "He will think he is clever. He will come from above, from the ridge." Jonas looked where she pointed, at the steep, rocky incline behind the cabin. He had always seen it as a barrier. She saw it as an avenue of attack. She was a natural strategist, her mind sharp and clear. Together, they turned the mountain into a weapon. They didn't just barricade the cabin. They laid a series of subtle traps along the less obvious trails. A tripwire made of gut, nearly invisible against the snow, was connected to a string of empty tin cans that would rattle. A deadfall trap, a heavy log held by a single rope, was positioned over a narrow pass. They prepared a secondary position, a small, sheltered ledge high on the ridge Lynn had identified, offering a perfect, clear line of sight down to the cabin and its approaches. They stocked it with a spare blanket, water, and ammunition. They worked in tandem, a silent, efficient team. He would do the heavy work, his brute strength moving rocks and logs. She would direct, her keen eyes spotting weaknesses he had never considered. A soft domesticity grew amidst their preparations for war. At night, they would sit by the fire, the silence comfortable now. He found himself talking to her, telling her about the mountain, about the seasons, about the hawk that nested on the highest peak. She listened, her presence a quiet anchor in his solitary world. She in turn would share small things about her home, the scent of the sea, the taste of a certain fruit. One evening she took his large, scarred hand in her own, tracing the lines on his palm. "You have kind hands," she said softly. He had never thought of his hands as anything but tools for work and survival, but under her gentle touch, they felt different. He felt different. The fragile seed of romance, planted in a moment of shared danger, was beginning to take root in the frozen soil of their strange new life. The blizzard came on the 6th night, a wall of white that erased the world. It was the perfect cover for an attack. The wind shrieked, muffling sound, and the snow fell so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Jonas stood at his post on the high ledge, wrapped in furs, the cold a physical weight. Below, the cabin was a single point of faint yellow light, a beacon in the maelstrom. Lynn was inside, tending the fire, keeping watch over the lower approaches. They had a system of signals. 1 lamp in the window meant all was clear. 2 meant the attackers were sighted. Suddenly, through the howl of the wind, he heard it, the faint, frantic clatter of tin cans. The trap on the eastern trail had been sprung. He strained his eyes, peering into the swirling chaos. Dark shapes emerged from the snow, more than he had anticipated, at least a dozen men moving like wolves, using the storm as their cloak. He saw the window of the cabin flicker, once, then twice. She had seen them too. The men spread out, surrounding the cabin. Barrett was among them, a large figure directing them with angry gestures. They were not trying for a subtle siege this time. One of the men ran forward, a lit torch in his hand, its flame a furious orange against the white. He meant to set the cabin roof ablaze. Jonas settled the rifle stock against his shoulder, took a steadying breath, and fired. The shot was a flat crack against the roar of the wind. The man with the torch stumbled and fell, the torch sputtering out in a deep drift. Chaos erupted below. The men scrambled for cover, firing wildly into the storm. But they couldn't see him. He was a ghost on the ridge, a deadly phantom of the mountain. He fired again, and another man cried out. But they were relentless. Another man, braver or more foolish than the rest, made a dash for the cabin's woodpile, intent on using the dry wood to start a fire against the log walls. Jonas couldn't get a clear shot. He watched, helpless, as the man reached the wall. A moment later, the cabin door swung open. Lynn emerged, a bucket in her hands. She threw the contents, water, onto the smoldering kindling the man had started. The man turned, surprised, raising his pistol. Before he could fire, Lynn swung the heavy wooden bucket, catching him square in the head. He crumpled to the ground. She darted back inside, disappearing before the others could react. A fierce pride swelled in Jonas's chest. She was magnificent. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, a desperate fight of shadows and muzzle flashes in the blinding snow. Finally, Jonas saw Barrett, exposed for a moment as he bellowed orders. It was the only chance he would get. He aimed, squeezed the trigger, and the fight for Lynn was over. The remaining men, their leader gone, broke and fled, melting back into the storm that had brought them. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the world was pristine and silent, buried under a thick blanket of fresh snow. The silence was broken only by the slow, grim work of dealing with the aftermath. They buried the bodies deep in the woods, marking the spot with a simple pile of stones. It was a somber task that left them both exhausted, body and soul. The immediate danger had passed, but a new, more insidious one was on its way. On the 5th day, a lone rider appeared on the trail from town. It wasn't a bounty hunter or another of Barrett's men. The man wore a tin star on his coat. Sheriff Tate was a tall, weary-looking man with a practical gaze that missed nothing. He dismounted, his eyes taking in the newly repaired window, the scorch marks on the cabin wall, and the disturbed snow where the fighting had been heaviest. He looked from Jonas's grim face to Lynn's calm one. "Heard there was trouble up here," Tate said, his voice flat. "Barrett and his boys went missing a few nights back. Found one of them on the trail down, shot up and half frozen. He told a wild story before he died." Jonas didn't speak. He just stood on his porch, his arms crossed over his massive chest, waiting. Lynn stood slightly behind him, her presence a quiet statement of solidarity. Tate walked around the cabin, his boots crunching in the snow. He saw enough to piece together the truth. "He said you had the woman he was after," the sheriff continued, stopping in front of him again. "Said you ambushed 'em." "They came here to burn us out," Jonas said, his voice a low growl. "They fired first. It was self-defense." "I believe you," Tate said, surprising them both. "I've known what kind of man Alistair Barrett was for a long time. But belief don't mean much down in Precipice. Barrett had friends, money. He owned people. They won't see this as self-defense. They'll see it as a mountain savage and his foreign woman murdering a town founder." The sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "A formal complaint has been filed. There's talk of a bounty. A big one. I can hold 'em off for a little while, but paper and money have a way of traveling faster than the law. You need to understand, the fight isn't over. It's just changed shape." He mounted his horse, his weary eyes lingering on Lynn for a moment. "You watch yourselves. The world has a long memory for things like this." He turned and rode away, leaving them alone once more. But the fragile peace of their sanctuary had been broken. The town, the law, the world of men. It was all creeping back up the mountain, a slow, unstoppable tide. The sheriff's warning proved true. Within a week, the bounty was posted. $500, a fortune that would draw every opportunist and killer from 3 territories. The mountain was no longer a refuge. It was a hunting ground. Jonas saw the signs first. A freshly broken branch on a distant trail. A boot print that wasn't his. The unnatural stillness of the woods that meant someone was watching. They were being stalked. The pressure mounted, a constant, unseen weight. The quiet intimacy they had built was now strained by a perpetual state of alert. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Jonas laid it all out. "I can get you away from here," he said, his voice heavy. "There's a trail over the northern pass. It leads to the next territory, to a city with a real railroad. You could disappear, start a new life. No one would ever find you." He was offering her freedom, an escape from the danger he had brought upon her by intervening in that muddy street. He expected her to accept. It was the logical, sensible thing to do. Lynn looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable. She rose from her seat and went to a small wooden chest where they kept important items. She took out the marriage ledger, the page signed by Jonas and marked by the preacher in Precipice. It was a document born of cruelty and coercion. She brought it to the firelight, her fingers tracing his rough signature. "In my home," she said softly. "A name is a promise, a bond. This paper, they forced it on us to be a cage, to make me an object." She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw a glimmer of tears in her eyes, but her voice was firm. "But it is the only thing in this land that gives me a right to stand anywhere. With you, it is not a cage." She tore the page carefully from the ledger. She didn't burn it. Instead, she folded it neatly and tucked it into a small pouch she wore around her neck. It was a declaration. She was not leaving. She was choosing to stay. She was choosing him and this mountain and the fight that came with it. "This is my home now, Jonas," she said. "Our home. We will not run from it." A profound sense of peace washed over him, chasing away the fear and the uncertainty. He had offered her an escape, and she had chosen a partnership. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb gently brushing her cheek. He leaned in and kissed her, A slow, tender kiss that was both a promise and a prayer. It was not the desperate kiss of people facing their doom, but the certain kiss of two people who had found their place in the world together. They stood on the porch the next morning, watching the sun rise over the distant peaks. Their rifles leaned against the wall nearby, cleaned and ready. They were not hunted anymore. They were guardians. The bounty hunters could come. The world could rage. They had chosen their ground, and they would hold it. He slipped his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his strength, her small hand covering his. They stood in silence, watching the light spread across their mountain.